weighs in on this, why there may be
U.S. a 50% ownership stake.
Collecting all the tolls that were collected.
A bridge project based on...
Dear Mr. President.
But the
27th, the Gordie Howe International Bridge is scheduled to open between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit, Michigan. It is a project Canada paid for, Canada built, and Canada carried the financial risk on. Yet just weeks before traffic begins to flow, the government of Prime Minister Mark Carney has confirmed a renegotiated deal with the administration of President Donald Trump that changes how money from this bridge will be shared. Supporters call it a fair compromise. Critics call it a concession made under pressure. What actually changed and who benefits is the question I want to work through with you today. Let me start with what was announced and when, because the timing here matters a great deal. On July 10, 2026, the Canadian government and the state of Michigan jointly confirmed that the bridge will open to traffic on July 27th with the support of the United States government. That announcement did not arrive in isolation. It came after months of uncertainty, a canceled ceremony, and a delay that pushed the opening back from earlier in the summer. So the headline is not simply that a bridge is opening. The headline is that a bridge which was already built, already financed, and already scheduled to open was held up, and then opened only after new financial terms were agreed to. That sequence is the heart of the story. Here is the practical picture of what the two sides have described. According to the Canadian government's official statement, Canada and the United States agreed to a series of cooperative measures focused on toll governance and transparency, along with investment in the region through a 15-year economic development fund tied to a portion of the bridge's profit.
A cable-style bridge, and it runs approximately 2.5 kilometers. Now, the bridge also has ports of entry on both ends, so it will be able to do advance.
That is the careful, measured language of a government release. What has been reported beyond that language goes further, and it is important that I separate the two. Multiple sources familiar with the talks have said the arrangement directs half of the bridge's net profits into a United States-run regional development fund for 15 years, while Canada keeps the other half. There is one word in all of this that is doing an enormous amount of work, and that word is net. Prime Minister Carney has stressed it repeatedly. Speaking to reporters in Calgary over the weekend, he explained that the split applies only after Canada has been paid back. In his description, all of the toll money comes in first. Canada covers the operating costs and services the debt on the bridge, and only what is left over after that is divided. His argument is straightforward. For many years, there may be very little genuine profit to share at all. He has called the arrangement a good deal for Canada and insisted there is, in his words, no big drama around it. I want to pause on that distinction because it changes how you should read every alarming version of this story. There is a very large difference between sharing half of everything a bridge collects at the toll booth and sharing half of whatever remains after a multi-billion-dollar construction debt has been paid down. Under the second version, the money flowing to the American side could be modest for a long time, or close to nothing, depending on how quickly traffic builds and how fast the debt is retired. The mayor of Windsor, Drew Dilkins, made exactly this point, noting that the incoming American money is tied strictly to net profit, and that there may be very little of it to divide during the first 15 years. That is also why one member of Canada's governing party has pushed back hard on the way this deal has been framed. Liberal Member of Parliament Ryan Turnbull said in a statement that Canada is not sharing toll revenue with the United States at all. In his account, Canada will continue to collect 100% of the bridge's toll revenue, just as originally agreed, and the new Economic Development Fund is tied to 50% of future net profits, not revenues, money that will only exist after operating costs are covered. So even inside the government, there is a real effort to draw a line between revenue and profit, and to argue that the headlines have blurred it. Now let me turn to the part of the agreement that has drawn the most serious attention from analysts, because it is not really about dollars at all. Infrastructure Minister Gregor Robertson's office confirmed that under the new terms, the United States must agree to any toll increase greater than 10%. A separate source added that Washington's approval would also be required if Canada wanted to lower tolls below a regional average. The government describes this as seeking concurrence on certain toll changes that are not tied to normal market movements. Critics describe it more bluntly as a foreign government gaining a say over the price of crossing a bridge that Canada alone paid to build. To understand why any of this is significant, we need to look at what happened earlier, and the original deal is where this begins. Back in 2012, Canada and the state of Michigan signed the Canada-Michigan Crossing Agreement. Under that arrangement, Canada agreed to front the entire cost of the project after the Michigan legislature declined to contribute public money, and the United States federal government did not chip in either. The eventual price tag climbed to roughly $6.4 billion.
U.S. trade, in addition to the ambassadors between Canada and the U.S., as well as U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. So not really clear what the
dollars. In exchange for carrying that full cost, Canada was to collect all of the toll revenue until it recouped its investment, after which the profits would eventually be shared with Michigan, the bridge's co-owner. So this was never a shared bill. It was a Canadian investment with a Canadian repayment plan attached. And that repayment plan was already long. Estimates over the years put the recovery period at somewhere between 30 and 50 years, and the original agreement itself anticipated that Canada would not fully recoup its contribution until at least half a century after the deal took effect. One former Canadian diplomat has suggested the timeline could stretch much longer, given rising construction costs and shifting border traffic. That context matters because it tells you the profit everyone is now arguing about was always going to arrive slowly, if at all, within the next decade and a half. Let me connect that to the delay, because the delay is what turned a construction milestone into a negotiation. Earlier in 2026, President Trump signaled that the original terms of the bridge did not sit well with him. In February, he raised the prospect of blocking the opening, and reporting at the time indicated he was seeking either concessions in broader trade talks or a share of future toll revenue as a condition for allowing the crossing to open. Then, in June, a ribbon-cutting ceremony that had already been scheduled was abruptly canceled, and the opening was postponed. Prime Minister Carney said the delay had been requested by the United States. The reason the crossing could be delayed at all comes down to the American side of the border. A bridge between two countries needs approvals on both ends, including from United States federal authorities. Sources told reporters earlier this year that no approval for the bridge to open to traffic would be granted without the sign-off of the White House. The United States ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, acknowledged at one point that the president would ultimately have to approve any agreement. That is the leverage that sat behind these talks. A finished bridge on Canadian financing still could not open until Washington was satisfied. There is another thread running through this story that I have to handle carefully because parts of it are established and parts of it remain contested.
So state and local leaders, even the federal levels at Congress, they kind of had their hands tied here until the president signs off on it.
Yeah, I mean, probably.
For years, the fiercest opponent of the Gordie Howe project was the Moran family, owners of the nearby Ambassador Bridge, the privately held crossing that has dominated this corridor for generations. A new, publicly owned bridge with lower tolls and direct highway connections represents direct competition for that private structure. According to reporting by the New York Times, Matthew Moran met with United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick earlier this year, and a filing showed that a Moran-linked entity donated $1 million to a political action committee supporting the president in January, weeks before the president publicly criticized the rival bridge. I want to be precise about what that does and does not establish. The meeting and the donation have been reported through corporate filings and major outlets.
We know better in Michigan, and that's a disconnect that we're not always used to.
Yeah, Canada has said from the beginning.
What has not been proven is a direct causal link between that lobbying and the delay. Ambassador Hoekstra has publicly denied that the Moran family's involvement was the reason the opening was pushed back. Separately, a senior Democrat on the House Oversight Committee launched an inquiry into the Commerce Secretary's meeting with the bridge owner. So we have documented contacts, documented donations, and an official denial alongside a congressional probe. Those are the verified pieces. The motivations behind them are exactly the sort of thing I will not assert beyond what the record supports. That brings us to how the two governments are presenting this outcome, because they are telling very different stories with the same set of facts. On the American side, President Trump welcomed the revised terms in a social media post over the weekend, describing the original arrangement as unacceptable and claiming he had secured a much better deal for the United States. He congratulated the Canadian government and expressed hope that both countries would see many years of success from the new crossing. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, whose state co-owns the bridge, celebrated the opening as a testament to the partnership between Michigan and Canada, and pointedly credited the thousands of Michigan workers who built it, without dwelling on the toll dispute. On the Canadian side, the framing is win-win. Minister Robertson called the agreement good for both countries and their shared economy. Prime Minister Carney has argued that the money flowing into the American Development Fund will be reinvested on the United States side of the region in ways that could actually increase traffic across the bridge, which in turn benefits the whole corridor.
A little bit more about the deal and the tolls and how that distribution and what that's going to look like.
Yeah, because obviously there had to be some rejigging of the original terms of the
That is a genuine argument worth taking seriously. A busier, better connected border zone can lift activity on both sides. Whether it fully offsets the value of the concession is a judgment reasonable people will disagree on, and it is not something I can settle for you with certainty today. Not everyone in Canada is persuaded, and the political response adds another layer to this story. Conservative critics have seized on the deal as another example of the government giving ground to Washington. A conservative critic sent an open letter to Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc demanding that the full agreement, including a complete accounting of the costs, be released before the bridge opens. Opposition figures have also linked this to a broader pattern over the past year and a half, pointing to Canada's decision to rescind its digital services tax and to revisit certain broadcasting rules, both of which followed criticism from United States officials.
To say the U.S. has been treated very unfairly by Canada. He goes on to say that President Obama gave Canada a waiver to get around the Buy American Act.
The through line in that critique is a concern that finished commitments keep getting reopened. There is also an important caveat that cuts through all of the confident claims on both sides. The complete terms are not yet public. Ambassador Hoekstra declined to comment on the specifics until the agreement is finalized, while adding that all funds the United States receives would be under United States government control. It is still not entirely clear which entity will actually govern the American Development Fund, or precisely how the profit calculations will be structured over 15 years. Much of what has been reported comes from sources familiar with the talks who were not authorized to speak publicly. So even as the government defends the deal and the opposition attacks it, both are working partly from an incomplete document. Let me step back and explain why this crossing carries so much weight in the first place, because the stakes here are not abstract. The Windsor-Detroit corridor is the busiest commercial land border crossing in North America. Hundreds of millions of dollars in goods move across this stretch every single day, and it accounts for roughly a quarter of all trade between Canada and the United States. For decades, the overwhelming majority of that commercial traffic depended on a single aging structure, the privately owned Ambassador Bridge. That concentration created a genuine vulnerability, one bottleneck, one privately held crossing, controlling the gateway for the continent's most important trade route. The Gordie Howe International Bridge was designed to fix that. It is a 6-lane, cable-stayed span, roughly 1.5 miles long, with a main section that ranks as the longest of its kind in North America. Crucially, it connects directly to major highways on both sides, Interstate 75 in Michigan and Highway 401 in Ontario, which means trucks can move without funneling onto city streets, as they currently must on the Windsor side. For an auto industry in which a single component can cross the border 7 or 8 times before it is installed in a finished vehicle, a wider, faster, more modern crossing is not a luxury. It is core infrastructure. That helps explain why industry voices have largely welcomed the opening, regardless of the toll fight. The head of an automotive parts manufacturers association described the new crossing as a significant operational improvement, with automated tolling and direct highway access, and suggested the finer details of the profit split matter little to a sector that builds vehicles jointly across the border in a way seen almost nowhere else in the world. The leader of a national trucking group had long pushed for a second modern crossing at this exact location. For the people who actually move goods across this border, the priority was simple: get the bridge open. That priority is also what shaped Canada's negotiating position, and I think it is worth being honest about the bind the government was in. The bridge was finished. Businesses across southern Ontario, the auto corridor, and the Michigan side had been waiting years. Every additional month of delay carried a real cost for truckers, plant workers, suppliers, and small businesses on both sides of the river.
Later than originally planned. The opening was delayed after the U.S. demanded a higher share of toll revenue, but last night Ottawa and the state of Michigan announced.
On the other side of the ledger sat the demand for new financial terms. So the choice was not between a good option and a bad one. It was between accepting terms that were not part of the original deal or leaving a completed, badly needed crossing sitting closed while the region absorbed the cost. Neither path was painless. One opposition critic argued that this bind was partly self-inflicted, saying the government's wait-and-see approach over the previous 15 months created a vulnerability that allowed the United States to single out issues like this bridge.
So as you touched on, Linda, we did sort of get this news that started to roll out yesterday about the opening date there, July 27th, and then we're still trying to figure out.
That is a political judgment, and the government would dispute it. But it points to a real underlying dynamic. When one side needs an outcome urgently and the other side controls the timing, the party under time pressure rarely negotiates from a position of strength. That is not a claim about anyone's character. It is a description of the leverage that existed when these talks took place. Now let me widen the lens, because the reason this story has resonated well beyond Windsor and Detroit is what it might signal about everything else. If the terms of a completed, fully financed infrastructure project can be reopened after construction is done and the paperwork is signed, then the natural question is, what else could be revisited? Canada and the United States share an enormous web of agreements: the Continental Trade Pact known as CUSMA, energy arrangements, defense procurement, critical mineral cooperation, and border management.
It was supposed to be a symbol of collaboration linking Detroit and Windsor, but the Gordie Howe Bridge has become so divisive, neither side can agree on when it will open.
The concern voiced by some analysts is that a precedent has now been set in which reaching the finish line is not the end of a negotiation, but a new starting point for one. I want to be measured here, because this is exactly the kind of place where speculation can outrun the facts. There is no confirmed decision to reopen CUSMA on the basis of this bridge deal, and one arrangement does not automatically dictate how future talks will unfold. What can fairly be said is that at least one economist has argued the profit-sharing arrangement sends a poor signal for the broader trade outlook, and that Canadian officials will now approach future negotiations with this experience in mind. Whether that translates into a harder Canadian stance, a push for trade diversification, or simply more caution remains to be seen. Those are possibilities that depend on choices no one has finalized. So who is actually affected and how? For commuters, tourists, and businesses in the Windsor-Detroit region, the immediate effect is positive: a modern crossing, lower tolls than the existing bridge, and smoother highway access. For the auto and trucking sectors, it means added capacity and resilience at the continent's most important trade artery. For the owners of the competing Ambassador Bridge, it means real competition, since the new crossing charges less and moves traffic more efficiently. For Canadian taxpayers, the picture is more complicated. They funded the entire project, and the new profit-sharing arrangement could, depending on how the numbers play out, lengthen the already long timeline for recouping that investment.
Very well known in Metro Detroit and throughout Michigan that the Canadian government fronted the money for this project and is going to pay it back with tolls. We've been hearing.
That brings us to the central question the audience keeps asking. Did Canada give something away, or did it protect a vital piece of infrastructure? The honest answer is that both can be true at once. Canada did agree to share future net profits and to accept United States input on certain toll changes, concessions that were not part of the original 2012 framework. At the same time, the government structured the deal around net profit rather than gross revenue, which its defenders argue shields taxpayers from a major loss, and it secured the opening of a crossing that businesses urgently needed. Reasonable people are landing in very different places on whether that trade-off was worth it. Let me be clear about what remains genuinely unresolved, because that is where your attention should go next. The full text of the agreement has not been published, and opposition politicians are demanding it. It is not yet settled which body will run the American Development Fund, or how the profit calculations will work in practice over 15 years. It is not confirmed how much money, if any, will actually flow across the border in the early years, and it is not clear whether this arrangement stands alone or becomes a template for future negotiations between the two countries. Each of those open questions could reshape how this deal is judged once the details are on the table. What I can tell you with confidence is what is confirmed. The Gordie Howe International Bridge will open on July 27th. Canada financed the roughly $6.4 billion project and built it. A renegotiated arrangement with the Trump administration now directs a share of future net profits into a United States-run regional fund for 15 years and gives Washington a say over certain toll changes. The Canadian government defends it as a fair, mutually beneficial compromise. The American side celebrates it as a better deal for the United States, and opposition critics call it a concession that should not have been necessary.
And connect the bridge to local roads, both in Michigan and on the other side in Ontario. But now it appears a political obstacle stands in the way. President Donald Trump took to Truth Social Monday night.
Those are the verified pieces, and I have tried to keep the interpretations separate from the facts. As this crossing opens, the thing to watch is not the ribbon cutting itself, but what follows it. The release of the full agreement will tell us whether the government's reassurances hold up under scrutiny. The early traffic and revenue figures will show whether there is meaningful profit to share at all, and the tone of the next round of Canada-United States talks will hint at whether this bridge was a one-time arrangement or a sign of how future negotiations will run. A structure built to solve a bottleneck has, for now, become a test of how two closely tied economies handle leverage, and that test is far from over. Thank you for watching my report on the Gordie Howe International Bridge and the last-minute deal shaping its opening on July 27th. This remains a developing story, and the release of the full agreement could change how all of it is understood. If you want to follow the verified updates as more details emerge, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next stage of a story that touches trade, politics, and the busiest border crossing on the continent.